punished. No longer do they need to discipline us. It's now really a society of control that we're living through. And I kind of made this move from Deleuze to, from Foucault to Deleuze later in terms of spatiality, control of spatiality, etc. So I think that this is a very important aspect as we move forward of both Stiegler's thought and how he takes this up. He will mention societies of control in the book For a New Critique of Political Economy. So anyway, I mean, any questions? I mean, I was going to read to you just a section on proletarianization, just to be a little clearer. I see that Will is not here yet. He kind of raised the question about proletarianization and labor. I want to say that Stiegler reads Marx very carefully, the section in the Grundrisse, pages 690 through 720 on the machines, right? It is an extraordinarily great passage, and unfortunately a friend of mine who wrote on this in his dissertation is not with us tonight, although he is in New York and is sort of active. But he wrote on the animation of Marx and the Grundrisse, on the notion of animation, and he wrote on the general intellect and animation. His name is Bob Spiegelman. But anyway, to go back to this, Stiegler is reading this section very carefully. He's reworking it. Again, like I said, there's both thinking beyond, if you will, but also an extension of Marx. There's also a creation of another kind of language that's going on, neologisms that I think are substantive. And I think we should keep this in mind. The same thing that he's doing with Heidegger. He is reading very carefully the question concerning technology and, of course, the existential analytic of being in time, but he's redoing it, rethinking it, constantly rewriting it. So try to keep that in mind. Again, this is a very, synthetic-minded work, but also there's a lot of, convergences going on, including this Husserl, Heidegger, Marx combination with Freud and Lacan also involved here. More Freud than Lacan, I think. Freud through the Frankfurt School, somewhat through Lacan, but more through the Frankfurt School, the Marcusian Freud, if you will, the Eros and Civilization, rather than the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. So, but anyway, we can talk about it. And Jean-François Lyotard's Libidinal Economy is also a very, very active work here. So I'm sorry to give this long bibliography, but I want to speak to the density of his, his thought and his activity here, trying to develop his own ontology, his own critique of political economy, his educational philosophy, and now really what I consider to be a very interesting psychology for the future, that is, not only psychoanalytic, but also phenomenologically psychoanalytic, in a way. So, so any thoughts from you before we go? I mean, I'll go to the text on proletarianization, or any thoughts from the reading last week? Yeah. Anybody?
I read an interview, or I watched an interview with him about, and he mentioned that he thought, in a way, that within the French philosophy, there was a way of reading Marx that downplayed the importance of the Grundrisse, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Grundrisse, yep.
That within French philosophy, there was a large focus on Marx, that Marx is very important for Derrida, obviously for Althusser. The two had great respect for each other. But Althusser really minimized the importance of the Grundrisse and of technology in his reading of Marx. And that also the same thing was true about the French reading of Heidegger, that the acts, he talks about a kind of repression within French thought, which I think he sees himself as kind of overcoming or analyzing, to reintroduce, to turn French thought away from the linguistic turn and towards this return to technology as a kind of extension of what he calls exosomatic existence of human beings, beginning with writing. But it was interesting that he kind of sees this as a blind spot of the famous, you could say, the famous period of time which we've lived through of French philosophy, where you have Deleuze and Guattari, and you have Gilles Debord, and you have Derrida, but nevertheless, he and these new thinkers are able to pick up and see this thing to which their precursors were, in a sense, blind or not paying attention to in the same way.
Well, I think you bring up a very good point, and maybe if I could give for a minute or two a kind of quick survey of the background here to French relationships to Marx, over the past century. Marx was not really read actively in the academy up until Kojève's lectures that began in 1933. Alexander Kojève was a Russian immigrant who gave lectures in Hegel, on the phenomenology in particular, also with some cross references to the philosophy of right. And everybody that was who's who in French intellectual life attended these lectures, during this period, and including Jacques Lacan, who learned an oral style from Kojève. He was a great orator, a great speaker, etc. So this was the French introduction to a kind of Hegelianized Marx, right, in a way. And up until that time, yes, there were other French Marxists. Of course, there was the Communist Party, which was a Trotskyist, Fourth Internationalist moment that became Stalinist during the war, and of course after the assassination of Trotsky in '39. After the war, Temps Moderne, the journal that Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, et cetera, Jean Palan, among others, formed, which became a kind of mainstay, the flagship, if you will, of French intellectual life, took up Marx in the 1950s. And the big debate about Marx was over a piece written by François Janson that criticized Albert Camus' The Rebel, which they considered, the editorial board at Temps Moderne, to be a reactionary piece against Marxism. Camus' Rebel kind of started the split between the two major figures of what we know in the United States as the existentialist tradition. So Janson was a Marxist, speaking of whom most people don't know who he is. The Janson Network was a gun running operation in Algeria. It was known as the Janson Network, very active in the Algerian War, etc., who also appears, I think, in the film La Chinoise. He is on the train with Annie Vizomitsky in the film in terms of a conversation in Godard's film, La Chinoise, the Chinese, Chinoise. So anyway, going back to this, so 52 becomes a kind of crucial year. This is when Sartre begins to make the so-called famous conversion, right? From existentialism to existential Marxism, and he begins what's called the question of method. Now, the reading, as Richard pointed out, is mostly around Capital, right, and the economic and philosophical manuscripts. And the Grundrisse is not read at all by any of the French intellectuals. It's kind of put aside, right, in many ways, right? And so Sartre's critique of dialectic reason, Althusser's early group reading Capital, right, as well as a whole host of other people that are working on Marx, the great attempt to try to synthesize, if you will, or bring together, provide some kind of conjunction, was Kostas Axelos, the Greek philosopher, who was the editor of Editions Minuit in France, and also the head of the Argument series. This was part of the socialism barbarism group, of which Cornelius Castillavas, Lyotard was a member, Claude Lefort. So you have these strains, all these kind of currents that are going around in Marxism, but again, leaving out the Grundrisse. So when Stiegler speaks to this, you have the existential Marxists, the structural Marxists, the orthodox Marxists, the party, Day, etc. You have all of these moments happening at once that are again, claiming to be the Marxists of the day. And then, of course, you have May of '68, where everyone is a Marxist, right? Read theory, it's all powerful, it's true. And of course, the Marxist-Leninist formations, the Marxist-Leninist-Maoist formations, of which Althusser and Badiou in particular, who's remained to this day a kind of fidelity to Mao. It's a kind of Maoism in philosophy. You begin to see this operative in Badiou's work. So anyway, going back to this question, in 1979, Tony Negri, you probably know the name, from Italy, the philosopher who had himself elected to parliament to beat the jail sentence, but was in exile in France. And Deleuze and Guattari especially, and Althusser got him into France. And he was given a space at the École Normale through Althusser to give a course. And the course was called The Readings on the Grundrisse. It was really actually a structural, a reading on the Grundrisse, and it was a different reading of the Grundrisse than the German and the Eastern European tradition, which had stayed with the Grundrisse to a degree. It was called, 10 Lessons on the Grundrisse, with a very good introduction by Harry Cleaver, a professor at Texas, who is the author of a book called Reading Capital Politically. So all to say, again, the Grundrisse became kind of talked about again, right, in a sense, and especially the chapter on money, right, and then on the machines. And, my friend Aronowitz, for example, incorporates this into his book, The Jobless Future, which is a book on, which I, kind of facetiously, but I think, write the jobless economy, right, instead of the jobless future. But it's about work and technology in our era. It was kind of predicated on the Grundrisse. So the Grundrisse kind of came back around. But in France, there was never any really serious reading. So Stiegler is absolutely right about going to the Grundrisse against this French philosophical tradition that did not read it. And for those of you that don't know, the Grundrisse was in 1857, 1858. You see Matt's little thing of the old man there, the Marx's endeavor in 1857, 1858 to deal with the Bastiat-Carey, problem in finance capital at that time, the bank crisis of 1857 to 1858. And he's filling notebooks that are, some people thought, the prelude to Capital, but for Negri, this is a much richer text than Capital itself. That the notebooks themselves gave a kind of, new hermeneutic flow, a new interpretive flow, and new insights into our relationships to machines and our, and the transformation probably of money into capital, which is, takes up about 400 pages of the 800 pages of notebook entries, right? So it's really done as notebooks. So this is where Stiegler, and if you looked at States of Shock in its entirety, he does have a section. I have it here. Let me see. I have the books on my bed here. He does have a section on rereading the Grundrisse, and this is interesting. It's the section. Let me see. Rereading the Grundrisse, pages 122 to I think 40 something. Let me see. 148. It's the last part of the first section before the university, before he gets into education. So this, again, to me, for Stiegler, if you're going to read Stiegler, in terms of seriousness, this becomes a kind of summation of his intellectual history, these first 6 chapters of this book, States of Shock. We don't have time in 3 or 4 weeks to go through all of this, but we did look at Unreason, and we can go back to that tonight a little bit, which began section 1. Section 2 is doing and saying stupid things in the 20th century. Then différance and repetition, thinking différance as individuation. He takes this term of Derrida, and thinks of it in Simondonian terms as individuation, as process. Après coup, the différent, which was one of the great propositional logic books written by Jean-François Lyotard, which was an attempt to put language games back on their feet after Farrason, who was a minister in France, announced there was no such thing as the concentration camps. This was the motivation for Lyotard writing the différent, to save language, to save the difference of the name, right? In many ways. So, and then rereading Hegel after post-structuralism, to return to Hegel, which we've done in another group. We're trying to do that in another group. And then rereading the Grundrisse beyond two Marxist and post-structuralist misunderstandings. So he's probably referring to this, Richard, in the interview, the misunderstandings about Marx and how this has happened, right? So, yeah, please, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, let me just say one thing here. I'm going to read to you what Matt is sent out as a thing. This is a proletarianization as a loss of knowledge,
right?
And this is from the Pharmacology of the Proletariat, and this in the section on the book for a new critique of political economy, and it's part of his beginning here. And so the proletariat, we read in Gilbert Simondon, is a disindividuated worker. So the proletariat is no longer those without property. You can be proletariat in Stiegler's terms, or part of the proletariatization process if you have a summer home in New Jersey, you have a chalet in Australia, whatever, on the coast, and you have a nice apartment in Manhattan.
Yeah.
What it really speaks to is the disindividuated worker, a laborer whose knowledge has passed into the machine.
Yeah.
So the knowledge, the epistemology, goes from being a human thing, human knowledge, no longer Promethean in a way, but Epimethean, right? In a sense, that is no longer the worker who is individuated through bearing tools and putting them into practice. On the other hand, the laborer serves the machine tool. You serve the machine tool, and it is the latter, the machine tool, that has become the technical individual. The technical individual, right? In the sense that it is within the machine tool and within the technical system to which it belongs that an individuation is produced. Yeah, please, go ahead.
I want to find a way of sending Bernard Stiegler my interview with Virilio. He's quite taken with Virilio.
Yeah, okay.
And this expression, go with throttle up at the Challenger crash, which I think is a perfect, simple way. I mean, when you hear that, you think the human being the pilot is controlling something. But in fact, it's not at all. It's the machine that's in control. He has no control. He's been proletarianized. He includes Alan Greenspan in this among the proletariats.
Yes. As Stiegler. Yeah, I was going to read through about that as well. Yeah.
Stiegler does, saying that, when asked about what was happening with the economy and who was in control, he said, it's pretty much automated. The machines are working at such a speed that no human being is. So in effect, his knowledge has been taken away from him.
Right. So let me just finish the reading here. This is a paragraph, and again, if you want to mark it because you're going to have it in PDF form, you can look at it, for your own perusal and edification. This technical individuation is, according to Simondon, a process, emphasize the process of concretization through which a system of industrial objects becomes functionally integrated and thereby transformed, as does the socio-technical milieu. The proletarianized laborer, however, is literally excluded from this transformation, disassociated from it, is not associated with it. So what's being taken apart here is some ways Marx's associated world of producers, ultimately, in terms of the utopic speculations of the early days of the economic and philosophical matters. Such a labor is not co-individuated. He does not exist. There's no outstandingness to him. There's no existence to him as, quote, the laborer in control of his labor. So this disassociated reality is a rupture in the trans-individual fabric which constitutes the labor environment, as it does all symbolic milieus, given that work is clearly also one such symbolic milieu, right? In their milieu of associated work, the work through their work, fashion and experience in which they cause the milieu to evolve, their tools, for example, or the way in which they are used, not to mention, of course, the products of their use. They open up the milieu of which they are the workers. But on the other hand, proletarianization is that which excludes this participation of the producer from the evolution of the condition of production and through which he works. So this has been totally taken away, right? If you go to a construction site, there are usually more machines than workers these days, right? If you really think about this, think about the levels of machine that is doing the work, and that the other people are there to kind of just, right, oversee the machine in a way, right? Yeah. As you know, at best on a given day, operating the machine, but just following commands. There's no real creative process going into this, in a sense. So this is, I think, what he's really trying to do. Proletarianization is a process of losing knowledge. With all due respect to my friend Dennis Bro, I think he's got a new term here. Maybe he didn't have to call it proletarianization, but in a way, I think it fits, right, in some ways. That we've gone from the worker that's alienated to that, the process of losing knowledge, right, in a way. The loss of savoir and of existence, right? Which is engendered, and it's, the savoir, which is engendered by grammatization insofar what it does is it short circuits processes of trans-individuation. The worker, you no longer are really individuated by your work, right? You are no longer individuated by what you do, right? And anyway, this contributes to what he ultimately will call the symbolic misery, which is part of the reading for today, right? And anyway, he goes on in this section, and I'm not going to read all of it. It's, but we can pick up with this. Again, I mentioned this, pages 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, up to pharmacology. This is a very, very important section in Stiegler's work, right? And he uses this term, hyper-industrial. He does not use technocratic, technological, post-industrial, at all. He does not go to he's talking about a hyper process in which this disindividuation is taking place. He's really about that process. So I think this is fascinating. I'm not saying that we have to agree with it. I think it's different, and it's a different approach, etc. And then he'll go on with the Grundrisse and Capital, and the proletariat is part of hyponymic memory, exteriorization of memory that we've talked about, versus the anonymic anymore, right? In a sense, right? So he has two things, and I'll read this, and then we'll go on to today's reading. Marx fails to think the hyponymic character of techniques in human existence because he is unable to think human life as existence, and for that fact, like Plato, he continues to oppose the dead and the living. And if you know Marx, he'll talk about dead and living labor as well, too. This is an interesting concept that Stiegler is taking on. He doesn't elaborate it this way, but I'm, exploding a little bit to the margins, and something that we can look at, too, in the future in its relationship to Marx. And then the anarchical study, the second thing he's drawing a conclusion of, a philosophy against the sophistic, where we started, in the book on techniques and time, the first chapter, around this question of memory and its technicization, is the heart of that political struggle, which philosophy was from the very beginning. So he's trying to go back to this heuristic moment, this struggle that philosophy was. For Althusser, philosophy is class struggle in theory. For others, the sciences of distinctions that are made. For others, convergence of ideas and concepts that, produce movement. But anyway, hence the reevaluation of the place of hyponemesis in Plato, as well as the deconstruction of the Platonic account of hyponemesis, which Derrida proposed, must continue the basis for a renewed project of a critique of political economy by philosophy, a critique in which technics remains the central stake. So what I've been doing during this COVID thing is I'm studying every vaccine out there. Right? I'm trying to understand this in a way. I'm looking at all the corporations involved, the rhetoric around it, etc., the way they do it, what are the medicinal, the therapeutic, the treatment from Gilead Sciences to Moderna to Pfizer to all these other, companies that are involved in this, because this is a question of techniques at work, really, in a way. It's kind of interesting. We can definitely orient our thinking to this time of crisis by looking at this. Okay, so the techniques is posed in a threefold question, and this is interesting too, and we'll go back to this next week. I'm just kind of doing a kind of prelude to next week. The organology, a pharmacology, and then a therapeutic. So the organology, the pharmacology, and then the therapeutic. And then again, the therapeutic is part of what Stiegler's prescription is. He has a kind of social therapeutics at work, etc. So this will be interesting to look again, this loss of knowledge, the inaugural struggles of philosophy, how this works, and etc. And the interesting thing, and I'm going to point out too, pages 45, the section 2 work is very interesting because he talks about the relationship to the central nervous system and how systemic stupidity is produced, right, in a way. This is a very interesting chapter 2 work, which is pages 45 to page 70. Yeah, okay? And then one other thing, and then I'll go back to today's reading. On pages 84, 85, 86, there's something called the economy of protections, which is his reading of chapter 25 of the 3rd volume of Capital, which is on fictitious capital. And fictitious capital by Marx is defined elementally as something that is disassociated from production. It becomes fictitious. It has no basis in production, right? This is Marx's definition, and then it'll go through aspects of bank capital and how this works in terms of fiction. This is what Stiegler has to say about this, and this is very interesting for those of you. I mean, I follow Wall Street very, very carefully too. So I try to figure this out. What is this? Deleuze once said, the stock market is the rationality of irrationality. It's a kind of interesting proposition to think through. Global finance is the rationality of irrationality. All right, so fictitious capital is a system of anticipations and risks which can only make judgments about illusions. This is page 84 in your handout for next week. I'll read again. This is very interesting. Fictitious capital is a system of anticipations and risks or gambles, which you can make judgments only about illusions, right? Everybody talks about the disconnect, right, between Wall Street and Main Street, the disconnect between the real economy and the, quote, stock exchanges. Well, Stiegler is giving us a lot of insight into this, quote, disconnect, which is not so disconnected in some ways. That is speculation, these illusions, and calculations about future possibilities which may never be realized. Very interesting. The illusion are speculations and calculations about future possibilities which can never be realized. Zoom will not heal us, but Zoom will create, hundreds of billions of dollars of new market capitalization, which is fictitious capital, which will never see the light of day in the real economy. But we'll go like Jeff Bezos. I think Amazon has had profits in 3 or 4 quarters of its entire existence. But Jeff Bezos, because of his stock, is the wealthiest, quote, man in the world in terms of money value. Yeah, go ahead, I'm listening. Yeah.
No, these page numbers are from
from the New Critique of Political Economy, which
right.
Matt just sent around. Matt
Right.
Benetti just sent.
Thank you, Matt.
Around. Okay, yeah. So anyway, it is this system, and this is interesting too. This is a very crucial paragraph to me. I think he's really thinking in this book in terms of concrete terms. You know, sometimes he's very abstract, but I think he's really grounded here in his critique of political economy, Stiegler, that is. It is in this system of projection of protensions, which as the organization, protensions as the organization of risk-taking, more or less limited, gives the capitalist system its dynamic. Capitalism presupposes the existence of free capital open to speculation, understood in this sense. So this is why the Federal Reserve Bank makes sure that there's liquidity in the stock market. Stiegler's got this pegged. You know, why is it that this is the movement right away in all of these crises? The crisis of the mortgage crisis back in 2008, 2009. You know, the problems of the financial meltdown of that period. This COVID crisis going back to 2001. The 9/11 crisis, of course, earlier than that. The 87, 88 crisis. You know, these are quote unquote stock market, you know, crashes, right? How do you build these back up? It's through this infusion of liquidity, which is really about an illusion, anticipation of illusions, you know, in a sense, right? It has nothing to do with the real economy. So anyway, this advance on reality produces these anticipations, since they are structurally opposed to speculation, must proceed before anything else from a motivation, and that is inscribed within an economy of motivations, which is also an economy of fantasy. Going back to last week, where we talked about what he criticizes in Marx. Marx does not see this economy based on this consumer economy that leads to fantasy. Yeah, even though Marx has, you know, a very elaborate analysis of the fetishism of commodities, he didn't see how this could be transposed and then linked to fantasy and fantasy gratification, such as an economy which produces protean libidinal economy, or to express it in more precisely psychoanalytic terms, and this is of course Marcuse and others and Freud, polymorphous libidinal energy. You know, the polymorphous libidinal energy, right? And then the polymorphous is unified by what is called spirit. So going back to last week, you know, the lost spirit of capitalism, this book that they're, you know, that he's rereading, this new spirit of capitalism through the lost spirit, is he's looking at spirit here in the sense as polymorphous libidinal energy. Yeah, this is what he's talking about as spirit. You know, has nothing to do with religious spirit or the Protestant ethic in the Weberian sense or whatever, right? He's really looking at this through a different lens, right? The investment in a libidinal economy which confers upon it its symbolic calibration and its constitution within a system exchange which forms a polymorphous social commerce. So these are the questions that pervade what he says is, you know, Chiapella's and Boltanski's book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, which never really took hold in the United States. You know, Piketty took hold because it's an easier book to get through. You know, this is part of the problem in the Anglo world, that, you know, there's a real density in Boltanski and Chiapella, of which Stiegler is working with, you know, in all of his work on political economy. Okay, so anyway, we'll go back to this because I think this is very important for our time to rethink the labor question in these kind of notions. You know, no longer is it just the workers are getting screwed. You know, the workers are disindividuated. You know, the workers are it's much worse than getting screwed in wage capital, you know, wage labor capital relations. So this disindividuation process is contributing to what's happening. So I mean, I'm sorry, I wanted to get to this because it does fit with some of the discussion we had about proletariatization and its relationship to Marx, you know, in many ways. So I would think, if you're interested, Stiegler and Marx and this relationship that he's created, because he's not someone that just says, oh, don't read Marx or I'm anti-Marxist. That's not the point. And this is stupid in a lot of the literature that to my mind, that says, oh, he's just anti-Marxian. It's not.
Mm.
No, he's thinking this through. He's trying to engage this in a very different way, both as an extension and as a critique, and also producing a new language that I think is much more fitting, if you will, or correlative to our times. So this is important. Yes, Andrew. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Would you say that you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, yeah. Right.
Would you say that, as you said, disindividuation is kind of worse than, I don't know, traditional exploitation, I guess we could call, or alienation?
I
And
think so. I think that's what he's saying. Yeah, it's
and I'm
much
wondering.
more abstract too. It's much harder to peg as well.
So my question is,
Yeah.
is that, in a sense, what seems to be escalating complicity in a way, or
With the capitalist class, is that what you're saying? The
well,
complicity with
complicity
the
with the
class,
capitalist
the ruling class?
class,
Yeah,
among, quote, the working class,
yeah.
and is that sort of like the attack on the ability to think independently and to um, systematically, it's not only think, but maybe also on an emotional level, on a body level, because I want to look at this phenomenologically also. So is it also why there's a kind of it's almost like a compounding acceleration of, I don't want to use the term disindividuation, because I want to find out what does that exactly mean. But it seems like it has to do with, according to Stiegler and what you're saying, it has to do with really an inability to individuate one's ends or one's community's ends.
Right, and also going back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago, this kind of new forms of infantilization. It fits into this. It also fits into this immaturity, this inability to mature, that he goes back to the Aufklärung, to Kant's, notion that there's no autonomy, in a way. I mean, he is relanguaging some of the, and rethinking the language of the Enlightenment, of the Kantian, Aufklärung, or the Lumiere, or, etc. He's really trying to rethink these terms in terms of autonomy, even though it's a different kind of language. But the language is, again, based on techniques, as time, not on, quote, control over those technical objects.
So is it also...
This is another thing. The loss of control should also be happening. The society of control is operative, but the individual or the individuating processes of control are not there. Anyway.
So is it also a machinization? This disindividuation process is also a machinization or a technologizing of...
Could be called that, yeah.
So when you're saying it's worse than, I want to say, mere exploitation, worker versus capitalist,
right.
You're saying that actually there isn't even a worker anymore. There's just a kind of appropriated, almost empty shell that has become technologized. And so maybe there isn't a differentiation. Actually, you mentioned like the construction side, there isn't a differentiation anymore between the worker and the machine.
The value is no longer between the, quote, struggle between labor and, wage labor and capital, if you will. Or the capital struggle is not the standoff in a direct way anymore, even though it's always already there. We understand this. And I'm sure Stiegler is presupposing this, of course. But much deeper than this now is that the laborer is so disindividuated, right? And then the worker is so disindividuated that there's no possibility of fighting back. It's almost like you're neurologically wired to the machine, right? And there's no separation anymore, right? In a sense, right? You're almost becoming the machine. We talked a little bit about we're inside the machine. in some ways. I'm not saying that that's the case. I think our politics hopefully can confront that, but this is where he's going to a degree, right? To a degree. And the exteriorization of memory, the hyponymata that is going on, this industrialization of memory, this kind of, tertiary retention becomes a politics, because that is a kind of liberatory moment, right? Versus that of a protensional economy that's based on anticipations of illusions, right? Like stock markets, future investments, et cetera, that are really based on an illusion. Whereas if you have this tertiary retention operative in a politics of memory, you at least have the capacity to confront things, right? I mean, this capacity is being taken away, this anonymic, this economy of tertiary retention. This is what's being destroyed. I mean, I just want to just finish for a second.
Sure.
The neme techne becomes a new political weapon. The techne, the craft of memory, right? and the craft of a historically specific memory becomes a new political weapon that has been erased, if you will, has been taken away, right? By this new machinic, domination by technical objects, etc. There's no longer the struggle with the boss, because you don't know who the hell the boss really is in some ways. That's another thing too. Yeah. So go ahead, Richard, and then back to Andrew if you want. Yeah. Yes.
Andrew, go ahead. I'll pick up.
Well, thank you, Richard. I just want to. This actually connects something for me that I've been sitting with since last week, when all of a sudden we started talking about what was happening, with Black Lives Matter, and the question of, is there a revolutionary leadership within the protest movement, let's say, and what's striking me, I had this question come up as you were speaking about, this sort of, it's a pretty abstract. It's not that it's not real, it's just a pretty abstract and detailed discourse, I guess we could say. We're getting into the technologization of the proletariat, let's say. And I want to say that I've been sitting with this question since last week. I mean, it seems to me people getting out in the streets, I'm thinking about Judith Butler and the theory of performative assembly. I mean, it seems like bodies in the street saying, you can't do this to me, and we're going to physically get in your way to stop you from doing this to me, to my community. Right. I'm just wondering, what's the connection here? It seems like that's like I think you said, well, it's not about monuments coming down, but the thought that I had was, yeah, take down the monuments. I mean, it's a gesture toward, it's a sort of expression toward, in terms of the tertiary retention, if I even understand the concept, which I may not.
Right.
But I'm like, yeah, okay. So finally, 400 years of colonial history in the United States is entering the popular imagination. So what does that do as far as, how do we connect Stiegler to this? How do we connect this really abstract concept of appropriation of the worker to like, hey, I'm going to fight for my rights because you're fucking with me, and you're fucking with my whole community, have for 400 years. Like what's the, what's bringing these things together, so that then, I mean, it doesn't invalidate everything that you're speaking to. Doesn't invalidate people just sort of like saying, well, we're done. We don't like what's going on. And then there was this question of, revolution and the event, and the fact that the event just happens, but you want to be in a position to be moved by the event, right, in an appropriate way. So there's a lot there. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to speak, directly through Stiegler to something like Black Lives Matter, except that obviously the tertiary retention is there, right? I mean, there are people, I mean, I don't know if you know the work of the historian Gerald Horne, has a great book on 1776, in which he'll speak about, you know, basically the founding of the United States was so that you could have slavery over here because England was ready to get rid of slavery, and this is one of the reasons that the American Revolution started. And this is part of tertiary retention. This is also part of what's been marginalized and excluded from the writing of history. A la Derrida, a la many moments of the decolonization of the dominant, you know, imperialist signifiers, if you will, you know, in many ways, if you want to look at this both linguistically and through the scholarship and all of that. I don't think Stiegler would have a problem with this. I think he's, again, looking at the system, the political economy, the system itself, you know, the capitalist system and the hyper-industrialization and how that's working, you know, instead of just movement politics, so social movements, in a sense. You know, I mean, I think this has some relevance to the social movement, but I don't think we'd find answers into terms of how does spontaneous rebellion take place, etc. But I will say this, unless there is a difference this time around, right, that this can very much fall into the trap of another dress rehearsal for a new kind of police repression. This is a problem. This is a problem that we're really facing going forward. This is where the notion, if you will, of having the tertiary retention is very active. Are we going to make the same old mistakes? I mean, I heard this person from Ohio State on Amy Goodman, the lawyer, Akhtar, I think is her name. She was very good, you know, in terms of talking about the last 10 years have produced a great amount of social movements and new thinking about this. The problem, once again, is, you know, some of the old left went through this too, right? In a sense, in the 30s. How is it different than the 30s? You know, and Juan Gonzalez made a good point, just like I'd make the same point too, about, you know, how do we get from off the pigs to defund the police? You know, is that a regression in terms of material linguistic codes, right? Is that how much we've regressed and we have to fight from that point now, you know, in terms of tertiary retention and revolutionary practice? Or how do we go from black power, taking power, you know, building a new kind of society around that instead of the just biological lives matter? And is this reduced to just bare life through biology as a movement? This is another question that I have. I'm just throwing out some ideas again. So it's very hard for me to just orient or apply Stiegler to the moment, right, in terms of some of the social movements. We don't know yet. To me, it's a welcome call. It shows that, you know, a lot of people are not servile. You know, the people have woken up a bit. The question is, what kind of, you know, this is why this question of leadership, to my mind, comes up. What kind of organizations can these people go to, you know, ultimately? You need organization, you know, I mean, like it or not, I mean, you know, we need,
So just to finish my, finish my question.
I'm sorry,
No,
I
that's
don't have the answers, I promise.
No, I know, but this is what feels like it's really up. Like we're doing in a way, or Stiegler's doing this kind of, I want to say, forward research.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
About a much bigger system. And he's not in the moment. Maybe he wasn't around, I know Baggio was around 68, but he's not in the moment of the mobilization, I want to call it, that's happening. And so I feel like what's needed is how do we, it's how do we connect the mobilization to the theoretical framework that's going to make it possible to move into a really transformed political economy, let's say. How do these things connect? Because the mobilization that's happening needs to be happening, and I think that's fantastic, and it needs to be supported from the theoretical position. But how will these, in a way, different cultures, we could say the culture of academia and the culture of activism, how is it that they can actually wed enough? Now, there are certain people like Yamada Taylor and Cornel West and I don't know, there's many others out there, Mark Lamont Hill, you know, that have a kind of theoretical grounding, a Marxist theoretical grounding. But this kind of really forward research, in a way, actually getting into the proletarian body and its transformation into machine, maybe we could say, which has these broad systemic implications of pacifization. How does that get to the people in the street so that we can begin to actually, what's going to come after the police are defunded, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think he does in the interview that I saw with him for OR Books, OR.
Richard,
You know,
do you know where the interview was, or
YouTube.
was it YouTube? Yeah, and do you remember the context, because he's been very active. Do you remember the year or anything?
It's within the last 2 months.
Okay, great, okay.
And
Just
he's
so people-
asked about defund police, and he kind of says from his own, he said, he starts by saying, I don't like to talk about things I don't have a chance to think about. But from his own perspective, just it sounds absurd to him. And he did at some point earlier on speak about, they have an expectation. He wasn't clear about who they are, but of a civil war in the United States. Some kind of civil war. And, I think that could, I think in some way that could come to pass. The other thing that's, again, I find a lot to like and support in Black Lives Matter, and I've done so. But at the same time, one of the things he's talking about in terms of the proletarianization is also the role of the culture industry. In other words, that people are having their, these transgressive desires kind of fulfilled and exploited through kind of the society of the spectacle, so that human beings lose the ability to sublimate. They lose the ability to think through. I think actually one of the weakest points of Stiegler's work is his connection to Freud and Lacan. But I think his idea of the lifting of that the drives are left loose by the superego. I don't think he takes into account the idea of the death drive sufficiently, though he does emphasize that the Freud he thinks is really the revolutionary Freud starts in 1920 with Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and then is the id and the s, or the id and the ego, excuse me. But nevertheless, I mean, he sees the lifting of the superego as kind of letting the Pandora's box of people's drives kind of run wild. But I'm not sure really, at least through Lacan, it would not be the superego. The superego doesn't exist. The big other doesn't exist. It's really about the death drive. It's about this thing that philosophy finally leaves on the floor at some point, which is that, you're not trying to, that even the idea of the liberal subject, the guy who says, fuck everyone, I'm going to do it my way, I'm the neoliberal, those are in fact social ideas. Those are ideas he's getting from society. Yes, those are really common ideas. So it's not that he's been liberated but his drives have been liberated. It's that those drives, which are partially social, partially biological, but partially social, that's the nature of the drive, versus the instinct, are this is the way they're being directed. He may think that's his own, pioneering idea, but in fact, it's not by chance that there are all these other people thinking exactly that same way who also are going out and buying guns. It's a false notion, but where the change would really come is through the slips, the errors, what Freud would talk about in terms of the death drive, the unconscious, the things that always escape, and that's where the freedom is. Ultimately, the freedom of the individual is in his relation to what he cannot control, what he can't aim in some way.
Yeah.
And so, that's where, he talks about the drives, but he doesn't really talk about the death drive. And I find his work so fascinating and so brilliant that I'm probably just not giving him enough credit, but it's an area.
Yeah.
But to get back to what Andrew is saying, I just wanted to say that in this kind of proletarianization, also is the culture industry. In other words, we're being sold this false good that finally we get to have our deepest libidinal objects. We get to consume. And of course that's total bullshit. Again, for Freud, for Lacan, the object of desire, or let's just say with Lacan, doesn't exist. In other words, it's tragic. A human being is basically, has a tragic element, and that the consumerism, capitalism, falsifies, has this false world where you constantly think, I'm going to finally get it. And so there's just constant misery. And, with the loss of the ability to sublimate, to paint a painting, to do meaningful work. And he talks about the end of employment, but he does talk about, in a kind of Hannah Arendt way, labor versus work. There's still work to be done. In fact, including in this recent interview, what are they called? Not exceptional workers, but workers who can't do away, people who are delivering food, for example.
Essential workers.
Essential. One I'm not when I try to get into Canada. I'm not.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But the truck driver with COVID it's bringing in bad produce. But anyway, yeah.
Right, but he does say those workers still, could have, in other words, it's not hierarchical. Those workers have a métier, what the French would call a métier. That's, as do nurses that are not, especially nurses. He talks a lot about nurses, are not proletarianized in the way that Alan Greenspan is, so.
Andrew, you wanted to say some more?
No, well, maybe just that I feel that there, it's sort of like Lydia said last week. I think there is a tremendous amount of consciousness of history among some of the leadership of what's happening now in the protest movement. And I think there is hope, but I'm just still, so I think there is the possibility of leadership. I think there is leadership. And I also think that what I get from where you're meeting Stiegler is that there's this kind of much more pulled back lens that's really speaking to a larger transformation in the civilization. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And yet I'm sitting with the pure kind of ethical question and the pain of profound just exploitation and death moment to moment that needs to be ended as quickly as possible. And so I guess I'm just still sitting with this problem of, the practical intervention vis-a-vis the theoretical framework that's going to hold it all.
Right, but I don't know if we should. I'll let you go in a second, Hugo. But I'm not so sure we should be projecting that we're going to get the all-inclusive theory that's going to give it to us. I think there's weapons here that we really can use and that are very valuable, both in understanding how things are working in our epoch, right, in our time period, as well as going back to Stiegler. There is transformative politics here. It is really changing the milieu. And when you raise the ethical question, it's changing the ethos. It's changing the environment in a way. It's not only about defunding the police and allocating resources, or just about reparations, or just about making it right. It's about massive transformation. Nobody's really talking actively every day about climate change right now. It's about COVID. So this is interesting. The way the system is great at these deflections, because we don't talk about the associated milieu. We don't have that kind of connection that he's speaking to, because we have been, in some ways, at least according to him, proletarianized, where we have lost the knowledge of the totality. We have lost even the intellectuals. The intellectuals are all completely over specialized. Lukács speaks to this in the 1920s. This has always been a thing in Marxism and Marxist, philosophy and history, where everybody's over specialized. All they can talk about is 20th century American fiction from 1950 on, but can't, cite anything from Shakespeare or from Homer. So this becomes a real problem going forward. I think this has been part of the system that we live under. Hugo, I know you wanted to speak. I mean, I'm sorry.
I'm just to sort of piggyback on some different things that have been said. Maybe in sort of Stiegler's terms, one of the ways I've been thinking about the sort of current political demonstrations and movement, the things we're talking about, is that it's a kind of struggle perhaps over the libidinal economy, like the control of the libidinal economy.
Absolutely.
And its perpetuation. So I think we are at a kind of, we're on a cusp, or there is a potential turning point. The question is, will the co-optation or appropriation or reappropriation of the potential for change take place? And I think that's part of the struggle. I mean, I think even the painting of the words Black Lives Matter in bold letters on Fifth Avenue or in front, on Pennsylvania, wherever, in Washington, D.C., by the mayor of Washington, D.C. That's a really interesting sort of maneuver that's taking place. Who is actually authorizing the painting of this on these streets? It would appear it's politically authorized, but yet it's not entirely clear it's politically authorized. I mean, and if it is politically authorized, under, like, for what purpose, under whose auspices? What is it? What is it actual? What does the gesture actually mean? It's a kind of strange, hollow gesture on one level, but yet it seems very affirmative of this ground that's being staked out and being fought over. And it's actually sort of saying, well, this is a monument now, in a sense, to the movement, and we're going to stake claim to this ground. But it could also be part of really, the sort of libidinal economy's attempt to in some way naturalize or appropriate, or whatever term one wants to say.
Modify.
Look at it as a DNC strategy, just like Occupy became for Obama.
Right, exactly.
Really think about this. Think about where Occupy really ended up. It ended up in the Democratic National Committee under, Barack Obama, which kept a lot of people, dancing in the streets in 2008.
Because I think Andrew's been pointing at this for a couple of weeks now, and a few of us have been chiming in here and there.
Right.
There does seem to be some revolutionary potential at work in the confluence of events. The question is there enough thinking behind it to push it further than the direction one might predict it'll go, which is to just sort of get normalized and appropriated into the libidinal economy, and then it becomes a function of consumer capitalism and how to profit from it and corporatize it and all of that stuff.
I think what makes Stiegler very interesting in this moment, unlike the 60s, we're not always in the streets. We're not always going to parties after the demonstrations, etc. We don't have that kind of human contact like, today, in a way. So this whole moment of the technical and technics as time becomes even more important for that revolutionary potential in my mind, right? Even though young people continue to meet with each other and try to do so. Can you really build a movement? Can you really have that revolutionary potential go without actually face-to-face organizational meetings? Can you really do it without, this kind of, joining of arms, being next to each other? And you see it in Portland, the moms against the, the kidnap, et cetera, against the police and the secret police now. And, what's going on? I mean, we're living in Chile in some ways.
Yes.
Trump is a
Yeah.
Pinochet
Yes.
character in a way. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think I'm making this up. You have 5 dictators running the world, and it's Trump, Bolsonaro, Duarte, Netanyahue, and what's the other one in the Philippines? Anyway, I'm missing one.
Just one further short comment on this.
Maybe President Putin, but he's a different animal. He's half educated, but anyway.
Just one further short comment on this point. In a way, another lens.
Yeah, sure.
Look at this moment is there's a kind of both awakening and struggle over millennial consciousness and millennial bodies.
Yeah.
And I guess the young, I think it's Generation X is the younger, they're the younger ones. They're still in high school. They're older kids in high school.
Right.
What's surprising too is just to say, I think I have been surprised to see, unbeknownst in a way to, I'll say anyone, but maybe that's not true, but maybe it's just me or how cognizant millennials, a significant number of millennials and generations X young people are to whatever they understand by the term socialism. And a kind of social, now whether they've read anything, I don't know. Where would they have read it? I don't know. Because there's nowhere to really read these things unless you go look for them or have access to, the channels that are going to get you connected to them. But there is a fairly heightened consciousness around that. So I think that's got the capitalists scampering and fairly frenzied over what, Stiegler is talking about in terms of, the care of the future generations. There is a real contest taking place to capture the millennial imagination and the Generation X imagination. I mean, and I think that's a real struggle. It's a very Stieglerian struggle that's taking place in that sense.
Right.
I think that's real.
Mm-hmm.
What is underneath it, I think, is open to debate or question. But I think that is real. And that sort of does make the moment seem different than perhaps other moments, perhaps.
Well, I want to add that we're facing we're on the cusp of an economic depression, which at least on the numbers rivals the Great Depression that led to the rise of the Second World War, Nazism, etc. I mean, it is the reality on which that these ideas are, the social reality in which these ideas are floating around is so radically different. I mean, if we're going to talk about, social reality, it's not ideas, it's social reality. The social reality is in the process of changing so radically that it's hard not to think that there is some potential out there which is different than I mean whatever we can say about the economy or the social situation during Occupy Wall Street. I mean, this is the Grand Canyon compared to a speed bump. So, one would think that things could take hold in a certain way. I wanted to also say about the libidinal economy, which I think is a very important point, is his use of this Greek word philia, which is kind of like friendship. And,
lover as well.
Yeah,
right? Sophia is
yeah,
also a lover and a friend together. It's kind of interesting, that Philosophia, is the lover of Sophia, as well
right,
as the friend to
but
Sophia, the wisdom,
right.
etc. So there's
But
multiple
often,
affiliation.
like
The way you're using it, yeah, yeah.
yeah, like in the Alcestis of Euripides,
Right.
the relationship of the husband and wife who've been together for 30 years, 40, 50 years is philia. They love each other, but it's not like, the young couple that, met 3 nights ago. I can't remember if Euripides mentions Tinder, but no, but
Freud would just call that infatuation, right? Yeah.
but it's
Love
but I also,
hypnosis and infatuation.
you know um, um, Michael, I went back and I was looking at Jean-Pierre Melville, the godfather of the New Wave, who's a French
Does everyone
resistant.
know who Jean-Pierre
Yeah.
Melville is? Good. Okay.
He's
I'm
a
sorry.
filmmaker he took his the name Melville was his nom de guerre in the resistance, and he kept it when he became a filmmaker, and broke all the norms of the French filmmaking hierarchy. Amazing story. But in his films are often about either the underworld or they're about the resistance to the Nazis. And the code, it's so amazing. In terms of Stiegler's work, I found watching these films again recently, just because for one thing is it's all about keeping your fucking mouth shut. It's like you should die before you open your fucking mouth. And any kind of written message, talk about the exosomatic. It's so much about being able, it's about memory and history and math and the integrity to the human being, which is the force of resistance to the fascists. And any kind of exosomatic is a risk. And it's very interesting to explore in this kind of Stieglerian world. But I do think, kind of like one of the things I like about Stiegler too is he's not only gloom and doom about the internet or the pharmacon. It's not only about surveillance capitalism. We're all doomed. Facebook is here. We're all fucked. He does still. God, I'm swearing a lot. I apologize.
It's an indication of the times. It's a symptom.
But
It's symptom. It's the symptom.
but he sees, that it can also be used, sort of like the Terminator. I don't know. It's my other cinematic reference is that there is, the term, I can't do a Schwarzenegger imitation. But there is a chance for resistance organizing through the technology. Also, what Hugo is saying, and I think this again is about the unconscious and the death drive, and that the liberal subject, whether it runs the U.S. government or the CIA, are constantly fucking up. It's the role, the death drive is there. There's constantly the slippage, the fuck up, and that's what a lot. There will be resistance. And I think what's amazing in Melville, Jean-Pierre Melville, just to return to him for a second, is, at a key moment in probably his most famous film, Army of Shadows, he takes out these books of mathematics, of mathematical theory. And there's a way in which, he finds within, the highest kind of forms of human thought, this ethos which is in alliance with the resistance, which is quite something to think about. But anyway.
Speaking to that, the Bourbaki group, which was a group of mathematicians, Andre Weil was Simone Weil's brother, who was a very famous mathematician, who were part of people in the resistance who were these superb mathematicians. So you have that, and the great mathematician who was remembered and was actually known to Lacan and others, Jean Cavallet was the unknown soldier number 5 who died in the resistance in 1941, who wrote a book on the theory of singular. Yeah, yeah, and very, very interesting, figure. Very, very influential on Foucault and Georges Canquillon. In a sense. So going back to that, the Melville film that's very interesting along the line of not speaking is The Silence of the Sea, his first film, which is a very interesting, a very beautiful film that really takes into account this whole notion of being silent, and the woman. If you want to watch one of Melville's films again, this is a great starting point to my mind. My favorite, of course, is Bob the Gambler, but I love that because it has betrayal, it has all these levels, that Stiegler is talking about, and maybe more closer to Stiegler, but yeah. But Melville is absolutely, and then forgotten force in film theory, not really talked about too much. It's all Godard, Truffaut, Claude Chabrol. He was really the forgotten member of the new wave, even though, in my opinion, was really the father of it, and probably the most accomplished of the filmmakers in a way. The experiments with, shadow and light and his formal techniques. But anyway, but going back to this, Richard, I just want to add, for Stiegler, this notion of the unconscious is not really operative. He doesn't really, again, like Sartre, like to a degree, maybe Merleau-Ponty, to another degree, to the phenomenological tradition, is really trying to deal with consciousness, right? That this is the circuitry that he's really looking at. So,
right.
in a sense, the unconscious drives, even though he's aware of this is really secondary to consciousness. It's going to be, if you will, Bewusstsein in German, conscience, at the top here, the transcendental ego at work, right, always, and then these levels of unconscious drives, the Freudian, Lacanian theory. So this is where he is. I just want to say, I'm not saying that I agree with this, but in a sense, he's not really dealing with, quote, cultural, political, or, economic unconsciousness. He's dealing with consciousness as a circuit, as a circuit of, et cetera. And the connection is much more in the more early Freud sense, Project for Scientific Psychology, to a neurological circuitry, right? In a way, right? Even though, yes, you're absolutely right. The 1920 piece on the death drive, I think he's very well aware of. Heidegger writes being towards death in Being in Time in 1927. So, death is on there, and we know the great work of the fascist Celine, Death on the Installment Plan, which is a great work about, occupation and fascist Vichy in a way. And Celine was an outright doctor as fascist, as we know.
Yeah.
And so anyway, just to keep that clear in this way. I mean, I would like to just move on. Again, to this symbolic misery. I don't know if you had time to read this, but this is volume 1, and I had just 13 pages assigned for tonight. And it really is a meditation. And this is something we can go back to what Andrew was speaking to, and Hugo in another way. The slogan, or the proposition from Gilles Deleuze that opens this. This is in the reading from Symbolic Misery, and you should have it. It's of symbolic misery, the control of affects, and the shame that follows, right? And so he begins with his famous quote from Societies of Control by Gilles Deleuze. It is not a case of worrying or hoping for the best, but of finding new weapons. And this is a rephrasing of what Deleuze and Guattari had said about George Jackson. I'm looking for lines of flight. I'm looking for new weapons here. I'm not interested in the old critiques. So in a certain way, this is very futurally oriented. What new weapons do we really have? What are being forged here, in a sense. So he begins with the first question of aesthetics, that of feeling and sensibility, which is very true to the Greek notion that um, aesthesis really means sensory perception, or the study of sensory perception. And he says we need to return to the question of aesthetics regarding its connection to the question of politics, in an appeal to the art world to get back a political understanding of its role. So he begins with a prescription. He begins with a, kind of an opening and appeal to the art world. The abandonment of the question of the politics and the art world is a catastrophe. So he's really against all this experimental stuff that was depoliticized that he witnessed in the last, 20, 25 years, in some ways. So he wants to go back. And likewise, on the other hand, the political world's abandonment of the question of aesthetics to the culture industry. So this is an attack somewhat on Adorno and the culture industry apparatus. The market in general is catastrophic as well. So the market economy, he's also gone. Obviously, I do not mean that artists should become politically engaged. I mean, on the other hand, that their work is originally engaged in the question of the sensibility of the other. The question of politics is essentially that of the relationship to the other in a feeling together, or what he calls a sympathy, right? A sympathy. The problem of politics is one of knowing how to be together. And I think this goes to what you're talking about, Andrew, in a certain way, to be together, to live together, to stand each other and stand together across and starting from our singularities, much more profound than our differences and beyond our conflicts of interest. So politics, and he has good definitions here, I think, it's original thinking in many ways, is the art of securing the unity of the state in its desire for a common future. In its individuation, its singularity is becoming one. Such a desire assumes an aesthetic ground. Being together is feeling together. A political community is therefore a community of feeling. So this is a kind of different way of looking at a political community, right? The sensibility, a question of aesthetics, in a way. If we're unable to love things together, that is landscapes, towns, objects, works, languages, then we cannot love ourselves. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago too, Stiegler is really into primordial narcissism, that we need to get back to auto-affection. We need to like ourselves again. We need to like ourselves in terms of sharing landscapes, towns, objects, works of art, etc., etc. Okay, this is the meaning, and Richard was talking to this, of philia in Aristotle. Loving ourselves is loving together things other than ourselves. So he's going to go back to the Nicomachean Ethics, which I guess most of you know was an ethics written for Aristotle's son, delivered in lecture form, to a group of students that was kept by Theophrastus in the ancient world. So then he goes on, the question of culture, as is formulated in its essence by art, is now more than ever at the heart of the economy, of industry, and of politics. The sensible community is today entirely fabricated by what Deleuze called controlled societies. And it is essentially on this front that the international economic struggle is taking place. This is interesting. You can think of the Americanization of the world in this context, which has been an enemy. Wim Wenders, speaking of filmmakers, has a great a line from Robbie Mueller when they were doing Kings of the Road back in the 70s. And he said something to the effect, the Yanks have colonized our subconscious, right? This is part of the notion of the Americanization of the world. Everything becomes Americanized, right? Dollarization too, in Malcolm X's terms, dollarism as the enemy, but really the Americanization, this kind of culturalization, acculturation. So Jacques Rancière was one of Althusser's original pupils who broke but always remained respectful, and has written very good books on aesthetics and politics. I recommend his work. He's written a very good on the cinematic experience too, and the image, on the image. The politicity is sensible. That the question of politics is immediately aesthetic, but he is strangely overlooked. And again, Stiegler's reading everybody he can. You know, this is a reader at work, right? So he's in the moment with a lot of his contemporary. Overlooked that the sensibility of the industrial era, bombarded as it was by marketing, has become the stake in a veritable war in which the weapons are technology and where the victims are individual and collective cultural singularities. And this has resulted in the development of a massive symbolic misery. So he's trying to show how this came about, right? Yeah, through not only through, you know, quote, our misery in the workplace, et cetera, but also by cultural conditioning, by the culture industry itself, this apparatus that has continued worked with us, how this control takes place. So in today's controlled societies, aesthetic weapons play an essential role. It has become a matter of controlling the technologies of aesthesis, the audiovisual or the digital, and in this way controlling the conscious and the unconscious rhythms of bodies and souls, modulating through this controllable flows these rhythms of consciousness and life. It is in the same context that the concept of lifetime value has recently been invented by marketing. Lifetime value, recently been invented by marketing. It's the economically calculable value of an individual lifetime, which amounts to the singularization and disindividuation of an intrinsic value. So this is very interesting. And I don't know who he's referring to by Manet, but breaking with tradition. Oh, the painter, I'm sorry. Manet introduced a feeling which was not shared by everyone from the 19th century towards aesthetic conflicts multiply. But these conflicts taking place against the backdrop of the massive industrial transformation of society engendered a process of sympathy construction. You know, how do we then, which is characteristic of human aesthetics. A creativity transforms the world in view of building a new communal sensibility, forming the inquiring us of an aesthetic community to come. We might call this an aesthetic experience as realized by art. In the same way as we speak of scientific investigation, it aims at the discovery of an other feeling, its future bearing. So I think he's really kind of trying to do a prefigurative politics here, to use our language, you know, what goes around in the United States as a value, prefigurative politics, that we need a future bearing that is based in the aesthetic world, you know, in some ways. So it is really a question of the aesthetic, right? So aesthetic ambition in this sense is today largely collapsed. We no longer have this, right? In a way. I mean, as Andrew would say, probably there's no dance out there. Maybe there is a dance, right? But we're not.
I would say that.
All right. And this is because a huge proportion of the population is totally subjected to the aesthetic conditioning of marketing. This is interesting, how he shows the conditioning of market economy and marketing, right? The Bernays, you know, post-Bernaysian, you know, level here, Stuart Ewan, if you know the work on captains of consciousness and all this, right? Hegemonic for the, now hegemonic for the vast majority of the world, and is therefore estranged from any experience of aesthetic investigation. The interesting thing about the Frankfurt School and their investigations to me was that real experience we're hidden from. We don't really experience. They've really talked about that. It's always this surface, the difference between, you know, Erfahrung, you know, and judgment versus that of, you know, the surface, you know, experience that we go through. You know, this is something that happens constantly to us. You know, we're so, you know, hungry, if you will, for the experience that we don't really experience in the deeper sense. And he's bemoaning this, and at the same time trying to reposition this, right, in many ways. So, and it's no accident. I'm reworking on. I've got a piece for the Situations Journal on Marcuse's late work, The Aesthetic Dimension, which is basically an outline that he never fleshed out, and he wanted to, you know, kind of go against Adorno's Beckettian, you know, kind of approach that, you know, there is no way out of here, right? In a sense, this kind of, you know, almost um, aesthetic nihilism, if you will. This is what capital has led to, and unless we penetrate through all the negativity, we're not going to get to the other side. But anyway, Marcuse seems to try to open it up by a return to Brecht and Antoine Artaud's theater. He starts to incorporate other things. But anyway, the whole point here is that the aesthetic dimension has been left out of the political question, right? You know, the aesthetic has really been left out. So meanwhile, the other part of the population, that part that continues to expand, turn those back on those who found her conditioning. So he said, you know, he looks at Le Pen, you know, he looks at the fascist right here. You know, he looks at Jean-Marie Le Pen, and of course his I guess it's his, is it his granddaughter or the youngest daughter?
His daughter.
Marine, huh? The youngest. That's now meeting with Steve Bannon and the Trump.
His daughter.
It's his daughter. It's his youngest daughter, right? It's not.
So.
It's not his older daughter who already had her day in the sun, right? Yeah, yeah. So anyway, so she's out there now. So he goes on to, you know, that really this April 21st, 2002, and this of course is dated, was a political aesthetic catastrophe. The people who are in a situation of severe symbolic misery cannot stand the way that modern society is going. Now, this could be the people on the steps of the Minnesota, you know, governor's house, right, a mansion, right, or on the state capitol, right, armed to the teeth that go into the state legislature. These are people that suffer symbolic misery, but as well as people on the left. It's not only subjected only to the right, in a sense. So he wants to go there. So the freelancers of the contemporary show business, along with contemporary literature and philosophy, are a cause of suffering for the ghetto formed by these zones. You know, these are zones of aesthetic conditioning he talks about. This is very interesting to me. You know, some of you may know Hakim Bey, Robert, you know, Wilson's you know, the work on temporary autonomous zones and other things like this, or you know, these zones of you know, new communities. But anyway, he's talking here about, you know, these new zones of the ghetto, right, which have been formed, right, by the zones of aesthetic conditioning. How does this happen? So he wants to look at this in terms of you know, the consumer society as producing this. And you know, most of you know this. I mean, if you look at television commercials, maybe I haven't watched television seriously in a long time. You know, I occasionally pick up on a sports game or maybe something good, but I don't really look at dominant TV. But when I was looking at it a little bit, studying it, you know, you could see the best of the Russian formalists are in the commercials, not in the thing. You know, basically the marketing people have taken up this aesthetic and used it in forms of new conditioning rather than what it was originally intended for, which was liberation and revolutionary movement. Yeah. So this is very interesting how the system can work with this and, you know, absorb what it is. So the society, he says, lives in a state of symbolic misery marked by humiliation and insult. And this is brought by the aesthetic war that follows the hegemonic rule, of the market. The vast majority of society, and this is something we should take into account, lives in an aesthetically afflicted zones where aesthetic alienation makes it impossible to live and to love oneself.
Right.
And this kind of, you know, poison and remedy that is happening on a regular basis. This to me is very interesting how he begins this prescription that the first step in Black Lives Matter is you have auto-affection, right? Yeah, in a way. So that's the first step. You know, you have to learn basically philia again. This is a very important thing, I think, to go forward with. You know, you have to learn philia. Is if you have philia, you're going to build something like, you know, what Cornel West loves to, you know, brother Michael, brother, Richard, brother Andrew. This is really ultimately, it has meaning now, right? Until then, it doesn't have any meaning. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. So,
Stream
anyway.
there is unnamed tributary that
Hello?
stream and a little waterfall. There currently is an existing pond that has been there for quite some time.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that. Yeah. Yeah. What happened? Are we here?
It sounded like somebody had a credit card debt.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, that's all of us, I guess. So,
Could've been me.
yeah. If I could have been me too. Yeah. Exactly.
Michael,
on
at the
time. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
beginning, there was you mentioned a book that was very good on images and cinema. You made a reference to it, but I didn't catch the author. I mean,
Jacques Rancière. Ranciere.
Yes. Rancière is
Very,
coming to my
very,
mind
very good on aesthetics and politics.
constantly.
First rate. Yeah. Of the group, the Althusserians, and I followed this for many years. Rancière is the most aesthetically sensible. Badiou is certainly the most learned. Balibar has all kinds of levels of political abstraction. Pierre Macharet has gone the way of being a commentator on the history of philosophy. No longer really engages to, occasionally make a small intervention. And I don't know what happened to the fifth member, Roger Establet. I think he's still alive, but he wrote on the community of animals in the Reading Capital group, which is really the intellectuals, in Hegel, the community of animals. That's what the intellectuals are referred to as, so yeah, which is taken up by Reggie Debray in a very good book. Yeah. So again, he's also immersed. I just want to point this out because sometimes we lose the sense of his historical context and his historical specificity. Stiegler is reading his French contemporaries. He's very French in this way. He'll read the Americans, but he's not reading Fred Jameson. He's not reading Aronowitz on labor. He's not reading these kind of things. He's reading Jeremy Rifkin. He's reading, in my opinion, secondary people in the United States on the labor question, to my mind. But he's very well read within the French tradition and the issues that they have. So, you're always positioned this way with Stiegler. But I find it very interesting, this whole notion, which he takes from Heidegger, of course, this conditioning, the conditioning of the thing. If anybody's read, I again recommend, Was ist das Ding, what is called, what is the thing, a reading of Kant's The Thing in Itself, the noumenal realm, is a very important thing to see how we are conditioned aesthetically, politically, etc. And Stiegler is using this to kind of undo, this kind of deconditioning that's going on. So this is another interesting moment. But how do we get to this? Oh, that's great. I'm going to the museum. We already go in with these presuppositions, etc. We don't really have the full experience anymore. I think he's speaking to this in a very original way. And I like this, to my mind, the notion of philia, both love and friendship, right, in the strongest sense, in the Aristotelian sense, is a very good starting point for loving oneself and being in sympathy with the others, right? This to me is a real crucial thing that we need in these movements today, And I just want to backtrack just for a second. I'll just say this, and I know I've said this before, and I've said this in this group, but it's something that I'm really very aghast about. It seemed like we had the opportunity, it may have reelected Trump, but the United States, the people of the United States on the left, and especially left-leaning, have a very difficult time making a political formation. They talk about it, they can critique Trump all the times, etc., But it seemed to me the capital that was in the Bernie Sanders war chest could have really created a new political formation. You know, you could have called it a progressive party, and you didn't have to run the candidate against Trump, but you could have pushed. You could have said, we have enough support here to make the Democratic Party, you know, adhere to a platform, and we'll throw our support behind you, and we'll drop out of the race. We won't become Ross Perot, what he was to George Bush, you know, during the Clinton election or something like that. But a beginning of a political formation that has organization, that it really, that has some kind of link, right, to two things. I mean, can imagine today if we had alongside with all this movement that's happening, a real discussion about national health care, you know, about,
Yes.
you know, single care, you know, a single payer, or, you know, socialized medicine, to put it in the terms it really should be, and, you know, or Medicare for all, whatever that means, you know, but yes, of course, care for all. And secondly of all, if we had again, the active discussion about destroying the fossil fuels a moment. But we're not getting this because, you know, Biden's in the basement, right? Mixing up, I don't know what kind of medicine, to, you know, paraphrase Bob Dylan. But anyway, you know, we you know, this is a real problem, you know, going forward. And I have a feeling this is part of my concern here. I'm all for the social movements. I'd be the first person to go out, you know, on the barricades. I walked many times. I lived 5 blocks when I was here at the Barclays Center before I left for my nomadic journey to try to get to Canada, which failed every time. But anyway, I do see this dissipation because the organization's not there. This is part of the problem. If you had a party formation, or at least a political formation to which these people could go to, right, in terms of real clout, right, you would be able to, you know, maybe begin to dent something. I'm not saying this is the only way. I mean, I'm very much for direct democracy or direct action, etc. But at the same time, I don't know if the power is really there, you know, in the organization. And that's what I also mean about leadership. Leadership is also, you know, Gramsci's notion of you know, the party is an agitational educational institution. It's not just a quote political party where you get into the electoral. It's agitational political process, right, and educational in a way. That's what we really need, to my mind.
Yeah.
Sanders, you know, his organization, of which I'm a member, our revolution, does continue. I mean, it's, you know, down the, you know, not on the presidential level. You know, I think they're, you know, like Jamal Bowman and the Bronx, AOC, of course. They do have candidates which have, you know, way outside the mainstream Democratic agenda. So they are working, you know, on these, which is what that's how the Republicans, right? I mean, they're
40 years ahead of the left.
Well, they realize, you know,
I mean, I remember
dog catcher, and you elect dog catcher, you know, you are way ahead of the game, and the Democrats totally ignored these downstream elections. Now, you know, Sanders is focusing on those. Some policies, you know, to redirect part of the Pentagon's budget. So they are
part of the national conversation. This is the problem, that you don't have that main speaker out there. You'll get AOC, or you'll get so and so here and there. You know, you know, the Democrat Socialist in Seattle, you know, etc. You'll get these people that will appear on the scene and make comments, but you don't have it part of the national conversation, which is more than needed right now to talk about what is public health. What does it mean to be a healthy? And, you know, he's speaking to this really, in a sense. What is politics except the management of one's well-being? You know, eudaimonia is the Greek word for this. This is really where we should be living. That daemon of our possibilities, and the eudaimonia that is, you know, about our well-being. You know, the furthest thing from the politicians' minds now. So so I think Stiegler is very well aware of this too, when he uses a term like social therapeutics. He will not do the new new politics of eudaimonia, because that's too traditional in a sense, but it has a basis in ancient Greek, philosophy and Aristotle, and it's in many contexts. And of course, Heidegger, despite his affiliations, et cetera, once again, the whole section on care in Being in Time. This is another very important part of how do we shape each other if it's not through an economy of care. So care, philia, therapeutics, are all kind of working together here, that we have never really gotten out of, if you will, the Marxist tradition, because of, the state would be, I think Stiegler is trying to think anti-statist here as well. Not that Marx was a statist. No, I'm not saying that. To me, he was an anarcho-communist, at the end, in a way. Yeah. But that's another discussion.
In this interview, he does mention also the recent interview by OR Books on YouTube. Stiegler also does mention COVID-19 in terms of the that a lot of the predictions about the spread were way off base because they relied too heavily on algorithms. He says that the interface of the human and the technological is completely overlooked and to the detriment. So it's literally poisonous. But there was kind of this almost fetish belief in that these algorithms would kind of run themselves, and as we've seen with COVID-19, nobody wants to take responsibility for what's happening.
So just to go back to where we began today with this whole thing of anticipation and illusions in terms of fictitious capital, who could have said in early April, when the stock market looks like it's really ready to crash, that you're going to have new highs made on the technology index 3 months later, 3 or 4 months later? If you had bet that in terms of the index and options, every $1,000 is worth $100,000 today in a period of 4 months. You had 101, return on investment. I'm not saying, that people did this. This is the best case scenario, but this is what happened. Yeah, in a certain way. And it's kind of interesting because everything was predicting this is going to be a crash, it's going to get worse, et cetera, and it hasn't been so far. So I'm just making the point on another level that you're talking about, that the algorithms were wrong and wrong-headed here, in many ways. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. I think what we forget a lot too is this whole thing of, Heidegger is very good at this in terms of temporality, and being in time. The future is always anticipatory consciousness, anticipatory interpretation. And this is something we really have to continue to think through on what can we anticipate, and what again, these weapons that we're getting from Stiegler, or what Deleuze wants us to have is very, very, very important. So anyway, let me just so he uses 3 terms. I don't know if you had a chance to read this or you had any questions, but he goes through the 3 sections of the the organology, right? And the pharmacology. I don't know if you got to this, but he talks about this on what happened to the affective domain, and this is on page 5 of today's reading, Symbolic Misery. What happened? I'm going to just put on a light. I hope it doesn't. Yeah, okay. So what happened to the affective domain in the 20th century? In order to absorb the overproduction of unnecessary goods, the 1940s saw American industry implementing marketing techniques first envisioned by Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. And I know everybody in this room knows the book Propaganda by Bernays. Very important book. To understand the United States in the 20th century, you need 4 books. Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, Education and Democracy by John Dewey, the book by Bernays, Propaganda, and most probably Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter, which was written later. I think this gives you a real, and The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorsten Veblen. This gives you a real sense of the idea of the American culture in that way. With all due respect to Black Lives Matter, but how this was pulled off where we are today, right? Then you can go back and read Douglass and, of course, through Chester Himes to Wright to Baldwin, et cetera, and, the great
Can you say that again, those 4 books?
Oh, yeah, sure. John Dewey, 1916, Education and Democracy. Thorsten Veblen, Veblen, Norwegian American intellectual, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew, a book called Propaganda. And then Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter, and Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. Yeah, and Lippmann is very, very important because most of this, manipulation of opinion and opinion polls is really contained in this work he wrote in the 1920s, post Woodrow Wilson. Lippmann was a very smart politico, theorist, very, very smart. And Veblen was great at analyzing what he called conspicuous consumption. I don't think Stiegler mentions Veblen except once or twice, but he takes a lot unconsciously from Veblen's book on the leisure class, this notion of the conspicuous consumption, et cetera. And Bernays is the father of modern public relations.
Yeah.
Those of you who have seen, which is then redone by Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky in the book Manufacturing Consent. Yeah, later on. And Ed Herman's book on doublespeak that he wrote too, Beyond Hypocrisy, where he talks about linguistic codes. The interesting thing, I studied, I was basically in shock, 1979, where all of a sudden revolutionaries were turned into, quote, freedom fighters in Latin America, which meant they were CIA operatives, etc. And you began to see the shift in the language in the New York Times that set up new codes that were thoroughly anti-communist, anti-revolutionary. And this is interesting because this kind of paved the way, if you will, for this Tina syndrome that we're still living through. There's no alternative. The remarkable thing again about Stiegler to me is he's really trying to craft carefully. I'm not saying it's perfect or whatever, but trying to build an edifice, a theoretical edifice that is trying to give some pointers towards an alternative. This is not reformist politics at work or reformist philosophy at work. Yeah, in any way. So so page 5, to go back to this, these techniques became advanced, extremely advanced, increasingly advanced throughout the rest of the century as returns on investments. I'm on page 5, were made on the economics of scale, requiring even bigger mass market. In order to reach these markets, industry developed an aesthetic particularly well adapted to audio-visual media, which refunctionalized the aesthetic dimension of the individual according to the interests of industrial development, causing him to adopt the behaviors of consumerism. Very interesting in this regard. The resulting symbolic misery is also libidinal and affective misery, which leads to the loss of what I call primordial narcissism. I want to emphasize this again. This is very crucial to his thinking, where individuals are stripped of their ability to form aesthetic attachments to singularities or to singular objects. Both auto-affection and the ability to form loving aesthetic attachments and singularities to objects, to develop one singularity. John Locke foresaw in the 17th century that I am singular through the singularity of the objects into which I'm in a relation. I am the relationship with my objects in as much as it is singular. But the relationship with the standardized object of industry is profiled and then categorized into particular, particularisms. And we all know this, that they keep codes on us, what we buy, the data that they have. They know exactly what we may go when we go into the store. There's like a chip in our head that's telling us what to buy, where they already know what we're going to buy, you know, in a sense, and what we might spend, in a sense. In this way, the singular is transformed into the particular, laying the ground for, communitarianisms of all kinds. For the particularations of the singular is its annulment and, strictly speaking, its liquidation in the flow of the commodity fetish. So you become part of this symbolic misery as this goes on. The audiovisual techniques of marketing lead moreover to a situation through the images I see and the sounds that I hear. My past tends to begin the same as my neighbors. You know, we share that great moment at Woodstock, right? Didn't we share that great moment at the cellar door in San Francisco when we heard, you know, Thelonious Monk play in 1958 or whatever, right? And the diversification of channels is simply the particularization of targets, which explains what they all tend to do the same thing, being increasingly constituted by images and sounds that the media streams through my consciousness, as well as by the objects and relationships with these objects that these images lead me to consume. My past is less and less differentiated from that of the other people. We become part of the same boat. We're all of this together, right? The we becomes very easily done, right? The we becomes the we, right? Without the singularity, without the differentiation, without difference. You know, this is what identity politics does in a certain way. You know, if you want to think of it that way, there's another kind of correlation here that's going on, how identity politics works. Okay, it loses, therefore, its singularity, which is as much to say, I lose myself as a singularity, right?
Just one quick
comment. Please, go ahead. Yeah.
What you're reading and kind of reviewing is,
sure.
The thought occurred to me that exactly what you just read, that Stiegler sort of outlines as this process, is visible or on display before our eyes in a country like India. So India under Modi, and
okay. I forgot he was the fifth dictator.
Right,
right.
Thank
you for reminding me of the big five. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if you call it sort of naked neoliberalism.
Right, sure.
Just that. So I think in a way, India is a kind of case study country where this process that Stiegler is describing is actually taking place in real time, so to speak.
Real time, okay.
Everything you just read is actually unfolding, and the constitution of Indian citizens as subjects and singularities is undergoing this very process of massification, kind of disintegration, you know, a sort of reorganization of the libidinal economy is underway in that society over the last 20 years. I mean, you know, so it's just an interesting notion that one can visibly see it in real time taking place. And I won't belabor this point, but in contrast, it isn't quite happening the same way in China. China is a different case in terms of how the libidinal economy is organized. But India, because of its neoliberalism and its having abandoned, you know, its sort of anti-colonial and decolonization kind of route and abandoning the planned economy, if you will, is visibly going through this. So I don't want to spend time on
no, I understand. It's good.
India and China.
No, it's interesting that you say it's happening before our eyes in real time. I mean, I think he's describing a process that's been accelerated in the West since World War II, and you know, goes back really to the 20s in many ways, which was part of the Wilson offensive, part, you know, partially the League of Nations, etc. We had all these kind of unification moments, right? That again, you know, I mean, maybe the 30s are before us in some fundamental way. This is another thing that we could think through, is that eternal recurrence of the same before us as well. You know, is this what might be happening, you know, as we go forward. But yeah, no, that's good. I mean, you know, I think the problem once again here is, again, people are being destroyed, you know, without even having that sense of liking themselves to begin with. That's part of the problem. The process is so great, the projection onto the, you know, the general populace is so great that there is no room, no space, if you will, for that individuation or for that ability to build the singularity, right? This is what he's talking about in terms of processes of individuation, completely blocked. You know, again, why the world is proletarianized, right? Both in the West, and what you're describing is they don't even have the chance to become proletariat. You know, this is a very interesting thing. In real time, they're not even allowing that chance to become the laborer, right? Than to be stripped of the knowledge, etc. The Promethean moment is no longer there, right, for them, right, in some ways. So, yeah, again, okay, so good, all right. So then he goes on the global misery, you know, what you were speaking to. This next section is on global misery itself, and he actually announces what's in the book. And again, this is volume 1 of his second great, you know, series, if you will, of multi-volume. This is on the hyper-industrial epoch. So symbolic misery is the first. The uncontrollable societies of decadence, or uncontrollable decadence of societies, is the second volume. And then he has multiple, and then the reenchantment of the world is his way of getting back into it. So again, he has this encounter not only with Marx, but with Max Weber, you know, from the disenchantment of the world, right? In which, by the way, Richard, psychoanalytically, he'll use a lot of work of Bruno Bettelheim in this, you know, again, this is an extremely well-read, you know, philosopher. Most philosophers aren't well-read. Stiegler is, I promise you. Yeah, it's good. Marx was well-read, to put it mildly. Anyway, yeah. So, yeah. All right. So he goes on. You know, I mean, he looks at this. I'm sorry, I just need a little light. It's getting dark. He goes on. This is very good on page 9. The question, the job of offloading. This is on page 8. Is entrusted to marketing, which from the 19th century seizes on nemotechnology to assure the proper functioning of the system. That is, the always accelerating and more entropic, and herein lies the problem, circulation on the energy or of the energies on which it is founded. But these energies are no longer founded in the symbolic circulation of participation, establishing the symbol, the symbolon in Greek, as sensible, cognitive, and spiritual sharing. And he goes on to define that a little bit. The functional circulation of energies in control societies produce consumers, right? This being the goal of the system, is that it offloads products and organizes the adoption of incessant novelties. The innovations of what we call modernity engenders the loss of symbolic participation. Why we can't come together, right, in many ways. This is interesting in a way. Why political and social movements cannot continue to endure for long periods of time. How does this happen? There's also a kind of symbolic and effective congestion. And he says, I'll come back to this. He has a section called the allegory of the anthill, you know, in this book on symbolic misery, which I think you have. Yeah, you have the whole book. Yeah. Okay, so the structural loss of individuation that I began to analyze, and he plays on the French verb to love yourself and love one another, from the 11th of September till the 21st of April, which is an attempt to deconstruct the fascism, the nascent and basically real-time fascism that was emerging in the National Front, you know, in Paris, you know, during that period, right? So in other words, desire itself, and this is an interesting psychology, is destroyed. Desire itself is destroyed, right? And because it can no longer be a circuit. And I go back to what I was saying about consciousness. Consciousness, again, is a circuit for Stiegler, always thinking through circuits. So he uses this Marx language, not circuits of capital, but circuits of consciousness. Very interesting the way the net works, in a sense, to play upon Emmanuel Castells, etc. Right? Anyway, a circuit of a gift, and we'll return to this in volume 2. So from here comes the general feeling of disarray that is prevalent everywhere when hatred of self and other grows and people carry out the kind of murderous act shown so well in Gus Van Sant's film Elephant. Here are the fruits of the death drive along with a strange pleasure, right? So he's looking at that. So with the appearance of marketing taking place at the same time as Fordism, it is no longer a matter of the reproduction of the producer or of his labor force, energy sources, primary materials, everything that Marx thought about, but it's also, and this is, again, going back to what I mentioned last week about his notion of Marx did not see consumer society to the degree that he should have, or maybe he didn't have the perch to see it from, but it's also about the fabrication, the reproduction, the diversification, and the segmentation of consumer needs. Marx certainly was on to plan obsolescence, but not to this degree. I think this is what he's saying in this extension of Marx's thought here. So the existential energies, to go back, Black Lives Matter should be an existential question, not only biological. This is another thing that we should really talk about if we want that movement to stay really up there. I mean, I'll talk more about that myself. But anyway, existences of producers and consumers which assure the functioning of the system are the products of the desire, the libido, of producers on one side and consumers on the other. Work, like consumption, is libido captured and channeled. Work in general is sublimation in the reality principle, and this includes, of course, artistic work. But proletarian work and industrial labor more generally have nothing to do with art or even craft, quite the contrary. And the consumer whose libido is captured derives less and less pleasure from consuming. He softens, numbed by the compulsion to repeat, of which bulimia and anorexia present strange cases, as did at the time of Hitler in the paradoxical and archaic age of industry, the eels and the tin drum of Gunther Grass. It is not by accident that it is right now that obesity has become the subject of debate. He's good. I mean, he's really good here. Yeah. And being, as it is, the devastating result of the exploitation of bodies along with their passions, their frustrations, and their drives. He's good on this. This is not, unfortunately, change the diet, the obesity factor, but he's really positioning this in terms of a politics, right? How this became a political conspiracy to produce this obesity, right? In many ways, right? It's like the kids, that are hyperactive, especially black kids, you give them Ritalin. It's unbelievable what the schools do and what these therapists are up to. These people that are pill happy and, prescription happy, right? In many ways. So this is happening because the industrialization of audiovisual and informational nemotechnologies, which have made the aesthetico-industrial war possible, while constituting marketing's arsenal, has led inevitably to the industrial division of labor, also affecting roles outside the workplace, such as the relationship with products, here with symbols, cognitive or aesthetic. And this has led to an opposition between the producers and the consumers of those symbols, an opposition which ultimately kills desire. This is why cultural capitalism, both informational and cognitive, is the most worrying problem imaginable for industrial ecology. This is again interesting. The mental, the intellectual, affective, and aesthetic capacities of humanity are massively threatened, and this at the same time that human groups have an unprecedented power of destruction at their disposal. The ecological crisis resulting from the industrial production of symbols opens the epoch of global symbolic misery. And this affects, although in different ways, the North as much of the South, and what we now distinguish as the extreme Orient, or, by symbolic misery, and this is interesting, therefore the loss of individuation, which results from the loss of participation in the production of symbols. We no longer are able to produce symbols. And again, going back to, this thing with Black Lives Matter, how do you give symbolic currency, beyond what it has? How does it really have meaning, that goes beyond being the street act? How do you really, in a way, give this something much more than it is right now, on the streets? This to me is a Stieglerian task, something that we could think about, in a way. Since you brought up the question, what is he, what application or orientation would this kind of thought have here? So symbols here being as much the fruits of intellectual life, right? Concepts, ideas, theorems, and knowledge, as of sensible life, art, know-how, and customs, right? And I believe that the present state of generalized loss of individuation can only lead to a symbolic collapse, or the collapse of desire. In other words, to the decomposition of the social as such to total war. So he kind of ends this, and if we don't really think this through, this symbolic misery, we're going to be completely collapsed by it. It's going to be a total collapse.
Just to expand a little bit on his analysis of the sort of conflation or collapsing of the global South into the global North. I mean,
yes.
Historically, that's really one of the great tragedies of the late 20th century into the 21st, which is the collapse of the global South. In an earlier form, it was the notion of the non-aligned nations.
Right.
The collapse of the Soviet Union, irrespective of what its struggles were, wasn't the only loss in the Cold War, but it was actually the beginning of the collapse of the non-aligned movement.
Yes.
And a viable, not only anti-colonial force, but a potential force to oppose this whole historical process that Stiegler's outlining, which is that, and so, this is what is, to go back to that thing, this is what's tragic about what we're seeing in India as an example. There are countless examples all over the world, is that it's a loss of the potential for opposing this globalized, kind of westernizing model of economy and libidinal economy.
Right.
So, it's holding on in a few places here and there, but it's interesting that I'm just kind of, keying on the fact that Stiegler is connecting North and South. He's connecting the West and the rest, which I think
right.
it makes the picture more complete and potentially more applicable, kind of in our current global predicament.
Yeah, I think you really bring up a very good point about 1989. What was lost there was a reference, right? Whether you agreed with the USSR and its policies, etc., at least it kept, some kind of non-alignment operative, and also still was a reference for something that was historically, I still believe that 1917, the Spanish flu leads to the Bolshevik Revolution. You have many, it's the same period, right? And all of Western, thought is against that ever happening again. They don't want 10 days that shook the world again, right? They don't want that 60-year period. So everything is that way. You even look at Trump right now, it's totally adolescent, but the left radicals who are like, AOC is, she's good people, but this isn't really radicality speaking, at certain level. But anyway, all to say that these leftist radicals that Trump refers to, this is kid stuff compared to what. Yeah. unfortunately. Yeah. So yeah. So I think if you by going to 89, yes, of course. I mean, listen, I go to a class and I have maybe 40% Afro Americans in that class. None of them have heard of Patrice Lumumba. Whereas if that same class 20 years ago, 25 years ago, at least 50% would know who Lumumba was, and maybe knew who Mobutu was, and who the what the moment was in history, right?
Right.
Dag Hammarskjöld, and the whole thing around the Congo, and
which may
please.
maybe a missing link
Yeah.
in the Black Lives Matter movement, in a sense, as a formation, is
Yeah.
just what you're saying, which is this kind of generational shift.
Yeah.
There is a consciousness of revolution, but there's a kind of historical amnesia or lack of connection or interconnection.
That's right.
There's it's a so there's a loss there, which ties into what Stiegler's talking about, which has taken place.
Yes.
And is being intensified. I think the thing about
it's a fear of mine about this, in a sense, because a revolution without thought is going to be worse than what we had before in some ways.
Yeah.
In my mind. I'm Kantian Marxist in that context. That you really need to have a revolution in thinking alongside the political economic revolution.
Well, Michael, I'm far from being in a position to represent Black Lives Matter, but isn't the focus, at least in the United States, really on the history of colonization and the slave economy, and also the abolitionist movement, the prison abolitionist movement? I mean, that's really the focus. So
that's what it becomes. I mean, I think the real question is there that I mean, I can speak to I mean, Cornel West knows the difference between Richard Wright's Native Son and Baldwin's The Evidences of Things Seen, right? We have this kind of level. Fred Moden at NYU can talk about societies of control with the best of people, etc. I mean, my fear again is the anti-intellectualism. It's not so much, I mean, I'm totally behind abolition democracy. I'm not about defunding the police. I'm not, open the prisons. I mean, this to me is, a condition, right, going forward. I mean, I made a proposal in class once. I got the students all involved in it. I said, why don't we give the prisoners a place in Utah, call it Oz, and their own country and their own economy, and they're going to run it better than any of your mayors and your thing, and just seal it off. There's the little city of Oz, run by the prison industrial complex without the guards and stuff like that. No, but I mean, I'm playing. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yes, of course, it's about slavery and capitalism. It's about abolition, democracy, critical race, critical, studies. Yes, of course. I see that. But the problem in a certain way is that, if you go into a classroom, and again, I've been teaching a number of years, at a place where, at least in the beginning, half of the class was usually Afro-American, right? In a way. And, I have always had very good conversations with most of the kids there. Viscerally, they're still completely on. But when it comes to the knowledge base, if you will, or the historical base, or the mnemotechne, it's not the same as it was 15, 20 years ago, much less 30 years ago. And this, to me, I mean, is a problem of transmission that we brought up earlier. I'm not criticizing. They may be better. They may be more prepared for a revolution. Maybe we have too much historical baggage.
Well, it's the beginning of a reclamation, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is the beginning of a conversation, a reclamation of history.
Yes, no, that's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, behind, I think it very much sort of, we're sort of naming influences or forebears. I mean, behind Black Lives Matter is very much someone like Angela Davis.
Yes.
Audre Lorde. I mean, these are people who are very much in the know of this generation that's driving this movement of Black people. And so, that's an interesting kind of, and if you look at Angela Davis's work, it's all about, to Andrew's point, it's all about the sort of internal colonization of Black people in the United States.
Let's remember, Angela Davis was a student of Herbert Marcuse and Theodore Adorno. And I'm not saying that we should go to that level or we need to bring back, and that's a precondition for going forward. But Angela Davis also, when she was being arrested, was writing on the notion of freedom in Kant's, critique of pure reason, on the transcendental, deduction in Kant. So this is not, a lightweight, right, that went out into the world. The same thing for Audre Lorde and others, Octavia Butler, all of these people have very much chops, in many ways that came out of encounters. And like it or not, I'm not trying to, privilege a group here, but we all are products somewhat of the German mind, right? Of the 19th and early, 20th century in physics, the breakthroughs in science. Philosophy is basically modern Greek philosophy is German, right? It's not Anglo, it's not American, it's not Spanish. The French, translate German metaphysics into French spirit, the esprit, but in a way. So in some senses, somehow, I'm not saying that has to be the model, but it certainly produced, the Cornel Wests, who knows this very well. I mean, he'll be the first to tell you. We need to, have that educational mix. So that's very true. I mean, Angela Davis is first rate. Yeah, first rate. There's no question about it. And I'm glad, that she's in the mix. Michelle Alexander's first rate in a different way, right? In a different way. Yeah, in many ways, right? But so is Jean Genet, who also spent 25 years of his life in prison and wrote, a thief's journal on toilet paper in the prison, right? And, and actually, if you want to, speak about Black Lives Matter, read his May Day speech of 1970 when he came in support of the New Haven Panthers, right? And gave a speech. He was smuggled in from Montreal, to give a speech. The May Day speech is amazing on language, etc. So I'm just saying, you have other groups involved here too. And if you can broaden that movement, you read someone like Pierre Guillotin, who's one of the Lyotard's favorites, wrote, the tombs for 500,000 in the Algerian War. What happens to the FLN in this? What happens to the Cuban Revolution? What happens to all these things that are part of our history going into this? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
To that point, what you were just saying, I think similarly, someone that, again, Black Lives Matter for shorthand to some extent, but a certain awakened generation of emerging sort of Black progressives / intellectuals / activists, potentially / revolutionaries, don't have as easy a time with Frantz Fanon, for example. Frantz Fanon is hard to contend with and to fit into certain categories of thought or certain categories of American political kind of, thinking. And so it's interesting that, someone like Fanon it's just interesting to me that he remains a sort of satellite figure, sort of will be
in the United States.
In the United States in particular. Yet, he represents a confluence of so much.
Right, of course. By the way, his clinical writings are now available. Another 600-700 pages of his clinical writings. Yeah. But anyway, please.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just another sort of.
Yeah. No, I understand.
All of this is like, now one could ask, well, why is Fanon not as palatable in the U.S. context? I mean, and to some extent, he does come out of that anti-colonial context.
However, the Black Panthers read Fanon. Fanon was on the reading list during the Panther period. That's another thing historically, that the Panthers did not have the anti-intellectual and did have that intellectual move. Just think about the books in Fred Hampton's apartment, just the title of the film, right? I mean, it's about the books. And I think I told you, Jeremy Glick and I are doing an annotated account of the 99 books found in George Jackson's cell. of which, 75 are written by, quote, old white men. I mean, or middle-aged white men or whatever. But anyway, it's okay. I mean, in a sense, it's got a lot going on. Yeah. So anyway, this is yeah, again, another issue going forward. I'm not trying to say, and I think Andrew's right. In some ways, Nietzsche may be right. It may be the end of Benito Cereno, if you guys know Melville's great anti-colonial piece, where Babo is like the wind. He has no memory, right? This is what the revolution's really about. The razor to, the Spaniard's neck, right? On the ship, on Benito Cereno's, the neck, right? In a way, the razor that Babo has, even though he's tied to the masthead and becomes part of the symbolic order. But, the white man says, so to speak, or the white colonialist says, they have no memory, right? They have no memory. So maybe in some ways that could be an advantage for this generation, at least in terms of the reclamation project. The question is what is going to be reclaimed, right?
Yeah. Well, the deproletarianization, actually.
Yeah. Right, his contributors.
Stiegler's terms. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. The reclaiming of memory. When you mention people like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, it gives you, it makes me start to think that the way the actions, the focus on these monuments torn down, which frankly at times seem, incredibly reductionist. I mean, of course, there's some of them Confederate generals, but when you start pulling down Ulysses S. Grant or, other, it just seems like, okay, yes, they were connected to slavery, but as, again, to go back, I always keep going back to C.L.R. James and his talks about Black Power, his speech in praise of Stokely Carmichael, where he also mentions Thomas Jefferson or the French Black Jacobins. It's not by chance he calls it Black Jacobins. He's saying something about the ideas of emancipation, that are in Hegel and that are in Marx and that are in the revolution in Haiti. And so that kind of complexity, I start to fear is not there in when I see these representations of Black Lives Matter. But then, when we talk about some of these, heavy hitters like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, you start to think, well, maybe it's just the way it's being represented to me is a misrepresentation for propaganda reasons of the dominant, regime or hierarchy of power.
I just wanted to go to the chat for a second, John. In terms of Stiegler, I see your question. To the best of my knowledge, he only mentions China only a few times, and that's in other works. I don't think in the ones we're working with right now. So, just to answer that question. And yeah, thank you for letting us know. Yes, the Black Church becomes a very active part of this movement of Reverend Barber, right, in many ways. But remember, the March on Washington was about jobs, too. This was another thing too. It was about work, getting work for people, in a sense. This march now and this movement is about, the claiming of life again itself, right? It's an existential biological, situation, not a question of just, getting work, etc. So this is an interesting thing. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think this is a very good discussion to have about, what could Stiegler offer in terms of new weapons and what is the mnemotechnics as we go forward, to this new epoch and the reclamation project, or if it's a reformist project, or is it really a revolutionary project? For me, what is in Marx's sense, and you know, again, I still consider myself a very avid reader of, Marx, and you know, consider myself certainly a Marxist to many degrees. But the thing is the social movement, does it have the poetry? You know, is the movement really that poetry of the future that Marx speaks about in the 18th Brumaire, in the beginning of the 18th Brumaire? Is it really revolutionary, or is it again just a reformist project? You know, because we all know, I mean, we're not stupid here. You know, we're communists, but we're not stupid. Someone told me that the other day. But anyway, uh, it's about a rent question. Should I give back somebody some rent that they paid? Well, we're communists, but we're not stupid. But anyway, the question, you know, obviously one question going.
What happened?
I don't know. Michael got.
Michael froze.
I've got to go. Thank you, everyone. See you
Yeah.
next. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. I mean, he's still connected. I don't know, he cut out. Okay, so I'll just close it, I guess.
Thanks so much.
Bye. See you all next week.